Hello, I'm Dr. Kim, and I am the professor for Christianity and Culture 2, this class. And the reason that you're watching this lecture on video rather than having it in class is I'm going to be out of the country during the first week of the semester. I will be in Egypt, and I promise I'll bring you back some pictures and show you some cool pictures of Egypt stuff. As it's a long commute from Egypt and I won't be able to get back in time for class, at least for the first part of the semester, we're going to do this instead. So in this introductory video, I'm going to go over the syllabus and then introduce you a little bit to what we're doing in the course, and then cover the first part of the course material that I'd like you to be familiar with. So that's what we're going to be doing here. All right, so let's start with the boring stuff, the syllabus. And you guys know how to read. You guys have been through this many times. You know how syllabus works. So I'm not going to read and go over in great detail everything, but I want to highlight a few points. Just in general, make sure you read the syllabus. If you have questions, a lot of them are going to be answered there. If you have questions after you read the syllabus, don't quite understand what it's saying or how it works, feel free to ask. That's fine. I don't have any problem with that. But do try to read the syllabus. Make sure that you check there first before, if you have any questions, so that you understand what's going on. Now, one of the things that's important to realize is this class is offered as a blended class, a blended format, which means that instead of 3 hours of class time each week, which we would normally have for a 3-credit class, we'll have 2 hours of class time and then an online component that will make up for that other. So you'll still get 3 credits, but you'll only meet 2 hours a week. And so that means that you'll have an online assignment basically every week. We'll talk about those as we go along here. Second thing I want to point out is attendance. Now, for the LBC attendance policy, for a class like ours that meets twice a week, you can miss no more than 6 total class sessions during the semester. Otherwise, if you miss more than that, it's an automatic failure. Now, if there's a problem like an extended illness where you're in the hospital or you have an accident or something like that comes up, talk to me. We can work around that. That's an unusual situation. But for most cases, for most students, don't miss more than 6 class periods. Now, the way that I deal with attendance is a part of your class participation grade. And obviously, if you're not in class, you can't participate. And so that's where I keep track of that. Class participation makes up a total of 10% of your grade. And the way I deal with attendance is I realize that things are coming up, from time to time. I try to have something each class period that I want you to get from that class period. So it's important that you be there every time you can. But I know sometimes you've got an important appointment that you have to make and it would conflict with class time. That's the only time you can get it, or your car's in the shop, or you're sick one day. Those kinds of things I recognize come up. And so to deal with those, I don't have excused versus unexcused absences. I'm not going to get into that whole mess of arguing about what is excused and what isn't. Here's the way it goes for me. You have up to 3 absences that you can have without any penalty to your grade for whatever reason. Now, that doesn't mean you have 3 skips, and then if you get sick, you come in and say, well, I took my 3 skips, and then I didn't know I was going to get sick. No, that's not how it works. It's 3 absences for any reason. So save them. Don't just take them. But if you need to, take them, obviously. But don't say, okay, well, I've got that, plus, if something else comes up. No, it starts to affect your grade for absences 4, 5, and 6. And what I do for each of those absences is I'll take 30 points off your attendance, of your participation grade for attendance for each one of those days that you miss beyond 3. So for instance, if you're getting a 95 or 100, let's say 100 in your class participation, when you're in class, you're participating in discussions, you're active and attentive, then if you miss, let's say, 4 classes over the course of the semester, your class participation grade would be 100 minus 30, which would give you a total of 70. So obviously if you miss all 6 possible absences, then you would lose a total of 90 points off of your participation grade, which would make it at most highest participation grade you could get would be 10 out of 100. And so that's going to drop your grade by about 1 letter grade, your overall class grade. So, don't miss unless, you absolutely have to, but just realize it affects your grade if you miss more than 3 class periods during the semester. One other thing I want to point out kind of in general here before we look specifically at some of the things in class about your assignments. In terms of electronics, I prefer to have an electronics-free zone in the classroom. Everybody's got a smartphone, everybody's got a laptop, and I recognize that some people want to use their laptop to take notes and such. I do give handouts for each of my lectures, and they have a lot of the information already written down in there, and there's room for you to write more if you need to take notes. So you should be able to just take notes right in class on the handouts that I give you in class. But if for some reason you have a specific need to keep track or keep notes on your laptop, just talk to me and we can probably work that out. But otherwise, I would just ask you not to use electronics. Don't be texting. Don't have your laptop open, browsing the internet or whatever, those kinds of things. If you're in class, be in class. If you're doing something else, you're not only missing out on your learning, but you're also distracting others. You're distracting me, and you're distracting your fellow students. A lot of studies have shown that when students are near somebody who is using their computer to look at Facebook or whatever while they're in class, even if they are not doing it themselves, they're still distracted by that, and it detracts from their learning. We'll talk a lot more about some of the reasons that I have some of the thoughts I do about electronics and things like that later in the course. That's one of the topics that we'll cover. But that in terms of classroom policy, that's something that I ask. Now let me mention our textbooks real quick. We have a number of different textbooks. A couple of them are kind of giving you the background and history that I want you to have as we study the course of American religious history in the 20th century. And then there are others that are important books that are written by some of the key figures that we'll be studying, and some of the contributions that they have made in various ways. And I've tried to choose each of the books that we're going to be using as ones that are going to be helpful to you, interesting to you. All of them are fairly accessible. I will admit that the Marsden text is a little bit dry at times, but it's still stuff that I think that you'll find interesting because it explains a lot of why the church in America is what it is today. So anyway, make sure you read the textbooks. There are some assignments that we'll be drawing from your reading in the textbooks that you'll need to do, so you make sure you keep up on that reading so that you can do well on those assignments. There's one particular book that we will be spending some significant time in class specifically talking about, and that is the book Culture Making by Andy Crouch. And we'll have a few days in class when we're actually kind of discussing some of his things, so that's an important one to make sure that you read ahead of class so that you're able to participate in those in-class activities. They'll depend on you having the book and having read it and become familiar with it. So those are the textbooks, and as I said, I think you'll find them interesting and find them helpful for your understanding of the church in America today. Now let's talk about assignments. Some different types of assignments. I mentioned our class participation. That's 10% of the grade, and that would include attendance, as I mentioned, but also your participation in class, in our discussions, that you're contributing, that you're paying attention, you're following along, you're being positive and constructive in helping us to get to accomplish what we want to in class. We've got a small class. I don't imagine that there'd be anybody who wouldn't do pretty well in that. I would hope that with the small classroom situation, we'll get to know one another well. We'll get comfortable with one another. I really enjoy a smaller class like that because it does give us a chance to really kind of ask the questions that we have and discuss the issues that you're interested in. That's what I'm really interested in and what I enjoy in terms of teaching. So even though I have things that I'm going to talk about, I'm much more interested in talking about the things that you're interested in that are related to the subject and engaging in those discussions. So feel free to participate. That will only help your class participation grade, and that will only help the success of the class as a whole. Our online assignments. I mentioned that you'll have different online assignments, and those are designed to kind of go along with a number of the topics that we'll be discussing in the class, particularly over the first portion of the class. Well, pretty much each one relates to one of the topics that we'll hit. Many of them require you to view some videos online, and I've got links to those so that you can see those videos and then interact with them. There's some questions, and I'd like you to view the videos and write your responses to those questions and turn them in before the class that assignment relates to. So the due dates are set to be for the day before the class period in which we'll discuss those things. And so having seen those things and thought about the things that are in the questions, then you'll be better able to contribute to some of the issues and topics that come up as we're discussing what those videos are relating to. You'll have about one a week for those. There's one that's a little bit different. It's an online discussion. It's designed to be one where you interact with your classmates online, and so then you'll post, you'll view part of the video, you'll post your thoughts, you'll interact with your classmates, and then the next week you'll view the rest of that video and then post a follow-up based on what you see in that part. But that's just one of the assignments. There are 12 of those total, so it's not quite one a week, but about one a week. So make sure you budget that into your plan. The due dates are all in the upcoming section on your Schoology page, so you should be able to kind of be watching for those and aware of when those are coming up. Each of you will be doing what I call theological trends presentation. If we were meeting in a regular class where we had hour and a half classroom periods rather than just an hour, I would actually have you do these presentations in class. But what I've decided to do in our blended format is to have you do a narrated PowerPoint type of a thing. You can use PowerPoint for that. You could use some of the other tools that are online like Cnovio or other things like that. But you'll do some research in relation to a 20th century trend in American religion that really doesn't necessarily enter directly into the focus of what we're covering in this class, but is still part of the background of what's going on and helpful to know about. And so you'll put together a presentation and a summary sheet that would be like a handout that you could give to your fellow classmates. And what I'll have each of you do is each of you will have a different topic. You'll post the presentation online so that your classmates can see and hear it. Then they will do a peer review, and so for each of those you'll either have the presentation to make or you'll have a peer review to make. Those have different due dates depending on which of the different topics they are. I've just assigned those randomly. I picked what I felt were the four most important ones that I wanted to have covered, and I just assigned them to you in alphabetical order. If you really have an interest in doing a different topic, talk to me and we can maybe switch that out. But there's an assignment sheet on our website that shows which assignments or which of those topics you're assigned and which dates those are due. Then there is the reading reflection journals. As I said, that's the way that I'm going to keep you accountable for your reading. So you'll have different questions that you can choose from, and you'll choose one question and you'll address it fairly in depth. And as you address that, you'll be drawing on the things that you've been assigned to read as support and as, conversation partner for your reflections. There are 3 of those, I think 3 of them over the course of the semester, maybe 4. But the due dates for those, the assignment sheets for those with the detailed instructions and all that are also on our course website. The other thing that you'll have in terms of assignments is a cultural analysis project. And this is a very fun kind of an assignment, but one that sort of also brings together all the things that we talk about in the semester. So this is kind of an end of the semester final project type of an assignment. And what this is designed to do is to say, okay, how do you, learning the things that you've learned as we've studied through the course of the history of the church in the 20th century in America, looking particularly at how it's engaged in culture, learning some different ways to think about how the church engages with culture. As you think through those things, then, can you apply that to some artifact or some trend that is currently a part of our society and do that kind of analysis? And so that's really what that is all about. Again, there's a detailed assignment sheet for you on our course website so that you'll know about that. There are also some unit exams and a final exam. Those are not real high stakes. I think they're like 10% of your grade for each of those. But they are kind of to help keep you on top of and reviewing the key points, particularly in relation to some of the historical things that we'll be covering in the first part of the course. There are study guides for each of those, and the exams are based on the things that we cover in class, so your notes would be your basic resource for studying for those. And so those are also on our course website. All right, the dry and boring syllabus stuff is now out of the way. Now we get to talk a little bit more about what's this class all about. And really what it has to do with is basically understanding American evangelicalism. Now, we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but I just want to kind of go through a fun little exercise here just to kind of get us thinking about what it means to be an evangelical. So you might be an evangelical if. You might be an evangelical if you list the Bible as your favorite book on your Facebook profile. You might be an evangelical if you can name all of these guys. You know them, the VeggieTales guys. You might be an evangelical if your prayer meeting prayers are often variations on, Father, we just want to thank you, that, whatever. I've noticed that that's one of the favorite phrases, we just, in evangelical prayers. You might be an evangelical if you know the name and author of this book. Actually, that is going to be changing, actually, I think. I think that the publisher has actually withdrawn this book. If you don't know what the book is, it's I Kissed Dating Goodbye by Joshua Harris. It was a big splash for a lot of the evangelical subculture. It's kind of fallen on a little bit less successful or enthusiastic following in the last 5 or so years. And actually Joshua Harris himself says, well, he thinks he wrote this when he was in his late teens or early 20s. He thinks that he would probably write it very differently now and wants to kind of retract it. But that was a big splash in evangelicalism for a while. You might be an evangelical if someone gave you this for your birthday. I know that happened with all 4 of my kids, I think, at some point. You might be an evangelical if your family prays together before meals, even in fast food restaurants. And of course, you'll notice that they're eating at the evangelical fast food restaurant, Chick-fil-A, right? You might be an evangelical if when you ask someone how they're doing spiritually, you're really asking, have they had their daily quiet time? You might be an evangelical if you've ever asked someone, if you were to stand before God and he asks you, why should I let you into my heaven? What would you say? And I guess you get bonus points, fundamentalist points, if you ever used a J.C. Chick tract like this picture is from. You might be an evangelical if, while you believe Democrats can be saved, you're pretty sure God is a Republican. You might be an evangelical if your idea of old-time religion involves an altar call. Now, all those things are just really kind of a light-hearted look and poking fun some at evangelicalism. But I want you to notice something. If you think through all of those things, not a one of those things had anything at all to do specifically with anyone's theology. Certainly, some of the aspects were maybe touching on theology, but they weren't about what evangelicals believe. They're really about evangelical culture. And that's what something I really want us to think about in the course of our study this semester. And that is evangelicalism. Certainly, there are religious aspects to evangelicalism, but in many ways, evangelicalism is really more a culture than religion. Even though we tend to think of evangelicalism in the context of religion, there's a lot of cultural things that go with particularly American evangelicalism that have nothing whatsoever to do with our beliefs about the Bible, our beliefs about the faith, the theology that we hold and that we profess. And that's important for us to recognize, because it's very easy sometimes for people who are involved in a church, who grow up in the church in particular, to sort of blend together in their mind religious and cultural things and begin to think that things that are strictly cultural have some religious significance. I remember once I heard the singer Steve Green, I think he was performing at a chapel service that I was at or something when I was in seminary, but he was telling the story about how he realized he and his wife had kind of gone a little too far in that direction in their own family when they were at a restaurant one night, and one of the kids asked, "Daddy, why don't those people love Jesus?" And he says, "What makes you think those people don't love Jesus?" And they said, the child said, "Well, because they're eating white bread." And apparently in their family, they had talked about why they eat whole grain bread and how they believe it's so important for them to eat in healthy ways to honor the Lord and those kinds of things. And so it had become wrapped up in their minds, in their kids' minds anyway, that how you eat, what color the bread you eat is a measure of your spirituality. And we do that in other ways. And so that's one of the things I think it's important for us to think about. How did we get to have this culture? What is this culture like? Are there areas where this culture maybe is in tension with, or maybe even in conflict in some ways with our religious beliefs? And as those who are going to go into ministry to our society, how can we first of all identify what is essential to the Christian faith and what is not? And second, how can we learn to think well and carefully and discerningly about whatever cultural situation we find ourselves in such a way that we will be able to address the truths of the Scripture in a meaningful way to the people who live in that culture? That's really what we're interested in studying. Our course is called Christianity and Culture. So let's think about these terms. What is culture? And one of the things that I think that, we hear a lot of people talk about that word, but do we really understand what it means? And really, I think it might even be better to think not just in terms of culture, but cultures, plural. Because at some level, really, we belong to multiple cultures. As we've been exploring already, evangelicalism itself is a culture or a subculture. And so those of us who are evangelicals have some participation in that culture, even though we're also participants in other aspects of our American culture. And sometimes from our ethnic heritage, we have certain cultural practices, certain foods that we eat, certain things that we say, and ways that we do things that are different from folks with other ethnic backgrounds, even if they might be American and such. So there's all kinds of these multiple layers of culture. And what culture is really describing is kind of that whole system and network of ideas, beliefs, practices that are common to a group of people. Sometimes also this includes language or aspects of language. All these things are wrapped up in this idea of culture. And so learning how to kind of think about cultures, to think about how to navigate through cultures, and as I said before, how to separate culture from Christianity so that we are able to properly communicate Christianity regardless of our cultural context. Those are important things. And so that brings us to the question, then, what is Christianity? How much of what we do and what we think, what we're used to thinking about as our, as sort of natural to us, how much of that is really Christian? And one of the things I hope that you have learned so far in your time at LBC and will continue to learn is that there are a lot of ways in which the Bible, the culture that the Bible was written in, or cultures, we'll say, because there were multiple ones, and the cultures of the people that were addressed are different than ours. And so we have to understand, okay, what of what we see in Scripture has that kind of sense of enduring common truth that can transcend or manifest itself in different cultures, and what isn't. And so a lot of what we think about Christianity really has certain cultural aspects to it as well. And so thinking through and sorting through that will be another concern for us in the course. So as we study Christianity and culture, we're looking for how do we, as Christians, 20th century American Christians, or 21st century American Christians, how do we think about the world that we find ourselves in? How do we think about the society around us, which is in many ways in conflict with our values? And how do we articulate and hold fast those values in light of the fact that our culture many times is not going to uphold those things? That's our focus. Now, in order to accomplish that, what I want to do is I want to walk through kind of the history. What is it that has caused American Christianity to have the shape it has today? One of the things I mentioned in our introductory exercise there was the idea of the altar call as old-time religion. Is the altar call really old-time religion? What do we really know about that? Well, if you look at it historically, the altar call is something that was invented in the 1800s, late 1800s. So for most of Christian history, churches have done without what we would call an altar call. So it's not old-time religion, it's really fairly new-time religion. And so these are the kinds of things that we really need to gain some understanding of in order to be able to and ready to think well and understand where we've come from as American evangelicals. So we're going to start by going back into the 19th century, the 1800s, and looking at a few things that have sort of set the stage. We'll spend most of our focus on the history in the first a little more than half of the course, maybe 60% of the course. We'll be looking primarily at the 20th century, but there are a couple of areas in which we need to go back a little to see sort of where the roots of the tree that grows in the 20th century came from. Now, one of the things that we need to recognize is that much of the way Americans think was shaped by certain trends intellectually that began in Europe. And this is particularly true of the Enlightenment thinkers and those folks who are associated with that. And we want to start with a guy named Immanuel Kant, who was a philosopher, a German philosopher, in the late 1700s, and he kind of was at the end of his life, right at the beginning of the 19th century. But his philosophy really began to shape how people thought, Christians in particular, thought about faith and knowledge. And one of the things that Kant does is he really kind of splits those into two different categories. For him, knowledge was things that you could use reason, human reason, and observation and empirical testing and those kinds of things to determine. So science was able to give us knowledge. Reason was able to give us knowledge. But we don't have the ability to do that kind of study about claims about who God is and things like that. And so what Kant does is he kind of separates these into two different categories. And from that point on, basically, Europe and America, following in suit, and basically all the Western world, really begins to think of faith and knowledge as two separate things. And knowledge is what we study, and faith is sort of a subjective, internal kind of thing. That's a huge change. We're used to thinking about that. We're used to seeing the world from that standpoint because our culture has bought into that so strongly. As Christians, we recognize our need to kind of struggle against that, but we need to recognize that's really a modern thing. That's something that's only several hundred years old. Before this, everybody just assumed that to know about God was to have true knowledge. But the Bible then doesn't give us true knowledge, right? If faith is not knowledge. The Bible speaks to faith. And so the Bible is about subjective things, and it's not about true knowledge. As Kant stated in one of his books, he says, "I have found it necessary to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith." So faith and knowledge now become enemies. Faith is no longer a way of knowing, but faith is something instead of knowing. Very important philosophical move here. So, how do thinkers begin to respond to Kant's arguments here? Well, some people kind of took Kant and ran with it. One guy was another philosopher named Ludwig Feuerbach, another German, and basically he says, I'm just going to abandon Christianity altogether. He says there's no such thing as God. God's not about knowledge. In fact, he says God is just our projections of ourselves. So it's like, we kind of think about what's the greatest and biggest, that anyone could possibly be, and that must be, who God is. But we still, he says basically when we're studying God, we're really studying ourselves. And that's what he says in this quote. He says, "The secret of theology is nothing else than anthropology, the knowledge of God, nothing else than knowledge of man." So Feuerbach goes in the direction of atheism and says, God's irrelevant. We won't study him. And that's where a lot of the university went with him. Now, there were some folks who didn't want to go that way, and among them is a guy named Friedrich Schleiermacher. That's a mouthful, another German. He's a German theologian. He grew up with, he's got a pietistic background. His father was a Reformed minister. And so Schleiermacher had an affection for the faith, for Christianity. But he felt the great pressure of the culture around him. Who his friends in particular, who were saying, oh, that's, you know, they were kind of following along in Kant and Feuerbach's wake and saying, no, this is meaningless. It's not real knowledge. Get over that stuff. That's superstition. That's old-fashioned. Get with the program. And so actually Kant wrote a book trying to convince them of the value of religion. And so that book was called Speeches on Religion to its Cultured Despisers. So that's how he characterizes the people he's addressing. People who are people of high culture, and yet they despise religion. And so the argument he made makes an important concession to Kant. He kind of follows along with Kant and says, Kant, you're right. Faith is not knowledge, but faith is still something. And the way he grounded it was being swept up as part of the Romantic movement. Schleiermacher says religion is just experience. He said faith or religion is just this feeling of dependence, a feeling of dependence upon one, this absolute who is greater than us. And so he says the essence of piety is the consciousness of being absolutely dependent, that sense of being absolutely dependent, he's saying, or feeling, or, which is the same thing, of being in relation to God. So this sense of something greater than me, this internal feeling I have of dependence on something greater than I am, that's really what relationship with God is all about. It's this subjective, romantic feeling aspect of who we are. Yeah, there's something to it, but no, I guess it's not knowledge. That's kind of the way that Schleiermacher went. And Schleiermacher is known as the father of Christian liberalism. When we're talking about Christian liberalism here, we're talking not about a political philosophy, but we're talking about a theological movement that turns away from traditional Christian belief and sort of recasts it, particularly in this term of subjective feeling, people's feelings or thoughts about God. Now, there's some other things that are going on in the 19th century, again, particularly in Germany and the universities there, that also impact religious studies and religion, therefore. One of those is the rise of what we call historical criticism. And during the 19th century, people are really beginning to kind of think about history in a new way. And they're beginning to recognize that there's a lot of things that were going on in the past that were not the same as today. And so therefore, the study of history becomes an interest of its own. And as it's, kind of living in the aftermath of Kant, historical studies wants to ground itself in that realm of knowledge. So it takes very scientific kind of character and a very rationalistic kind of character based on human reason and methods of reasoning that are appropriate to the study of history. And so this turn to history begins to affect everything. It begins to affect, in particular, biblical studies, whereas in the past, biblical studies has been to try to understand what the Bible is saying, which makes sense. Now biblical studies is a little bit different. Biblical studies, remember, now the Bible is no longer seen as God's word, because religion is not about knowledge of God. It's really just about human thoughts and feelings about God. And so therefore, what history is going to do with the Bible is then look at it as a historical document to learn about the people who wrote the Bible, the people who read the Bible, the people who were shaped by the Bible, and not about the God that the Bible's talking about. So the rise of the German university system historical studies finds its place there, and biblical studies has to take that kind of a turn in order to maintain its status as an area of knowledge. It turns to history. There's a big focus here on method, using the right method, the right approach to finding these things out. And the quest now becomes to discover the facts behind the text. We can't rely on the text. The text says certain things, but we can go and we can dig things up, and we can make conclusions based on what we find, and we can date things based on what we find, and then we can check whether the Bible really is saying what what really happened, or if it's made something up along the way. And in many cases, the historical critics assumed that the Bible was making things up because they hadn't verified these things through their historical and archaeological studies. And in many cases, it just didn't measure up to rational, the way that they felt rational human beings would understand things. So they just out of hand dismissed things like resurrection of Christ. Of course, people don't rise from the dead. Any reasonable person knows that, and so therefore the Bible authors are making that up. These are the kinds of ways that they began to be shaped in their thinking, and that's one of the things that history had done to biblical studies. Now, where this really becomes something that we see as a part of religious studies, particularly New Testament studies, is with the work of a New Testament scholar by the name of David Strauss, another German. And what Strauss did was he said, let's turn a historical, critical eye on Jesus, what the Gospels tell us about Jesus. And we aren't going to trust the Gospels as God's word, as faithful witnesses. We're going to see what will pass muster according to religion and our historical knowledge of the time that was written. And what he ended up doing is separating the Christ of faith and the Jesus of history. And what we mean by that, what he meant by that, is similar to what Kant had done. Faith and knowledge are not now the same thing. They're two different things. Strauss is saying the Jesus that we believe, or the Christ that we believe, is one thing, and the Jesus that really walked the earth is a different thing. And we have no reason to believe that there's any historical grounding for those stories of Jesus as God. Jesus is a miracle worker. Jesus is one who rose from the dead. Jesus was an ordinary man just like the rest of us. And that's really what we find when we try to study him historically. And so basically, he removes the faith of the church in Jesus now away from the historical object, person, Jesus, and says, well, it's just a way, the stories about Jesus in the Bible are just a way for people to kind of talk about this philosophical idea of the merging of humanity and deity. And that's something that really happens in all of us. And this is what one of the places he says that. He wrote this. He says, humanity is the union of the two natures, God become man, the infinite manifesting itself in the finite, and the finite spirit remembering its infinitude. So when we're talking about religious things, we're really just talking about these philosophical ideas about sort of the broad nature of humanity. And that's where Strauss went with it. In fact, Strauss goes on to say that the proper method of biblical studies really is historical. We just need to own up to the fact that we can do away with all of that religious sentimental tradition and just study it through the hard scientific lens of historical studies. And that's the best way to study the Bible. And in fact, he would say Christianity can survive as on its own without any historical grounding. We don't need to preserve any myths about Jesus as divine, as having risen from the dead or anything like that, because all we have to do is just hold strongly to the historical truth and recognize that the religious truth is completely different. So then where does that leave religion? What does religion have to speak to? If it doesn't have to speak to history, if it's not able to speak to anything that's true, well, what religion does is it becomes a way to talk about ethics, how to be good. And this is where Jesus now becomes recast as a great moral teacher. Okay, so ethics is kind of the direction that theology takes, liberal theology in the tradition of Friedrich Schleiermacher. Now, these couple of generations on beyond Schleiermacher, the theologians begin to say, no, Christianity is just about how we live, how we treat one another. And Jesus was teaching us the right way to think about one another and to think about what we ought to do. And so there's an attempt to preserve a practical dimension to Christian faith, even while they are letting go of any historical or factual or truth aspect to the teachings of the Bible and teachings of the church. So feeling was, in Schleiermacher's attempt to preserve religion by talking about it as feeling and experience, that has to have some kind of a practical outcome in order for us to really still justify studying religion at all. And since the feeling itself, the experience itself was not something that was worth studying, that's where they turned to this practical, ethical approach. One of the key people who was involved in that was a guy named Albert Ritschl, who lived in his heyday was 1860s, 1870s. And he says, well, the kingdom of God is really an ethical kingdom. The kingdom of God is about a way of life, about a way that people ought to live, and the way that humans ought to organize their societies. And so what he says is that theology then, the study of theology, becomes study of value judgments that was made by the Christian community. And let me explain what he's doing here. Basically what he's saying is when the early church says things like Jesus is God, he's saying, well, they really weren't making the claim that Jesus really is God. But what they were saying is his teaching is so valuable to the community that it has that much value to us. So much value that we'd say his words are like God's words. So you can see how he's distorting Christian truth. He's still using Christian terms. He can say, oh, well, we'll say Jesus is God, but we don't really mean what the church has meant for 1850 years before this when they've said Jesus is God. What they really meant is that Jesus' teaching is as valuable to us as God himself. You see how insidious this kind of attack against Christianity is. Christianity begins to be redefined from the inside out. The same words are used, but underneath the meanings of those words have been really gutted, and so there's no substance behind that. And in fact, Ritschl will go on to say that Christianity is the specifically moral religion. In other words, what makes Christianity its own thing, what separates it and makes it unique, is that it is the highest, basically it proclaims the highest morality for humans. Now, in fact, one of the classic articulations of this idea comes from no less than a church historian, a great church historian by the name of Adolf Harnack, another German. These are all Germans that are behind a lot of these moves here. But Adolf Harnack writes toward the end of his career a book called The Essence of Christianity. At least that was its title in German. In America, it was published under the title, What is Christianity? But basically he's saying, let's talk about what Christianity really is. He says we need to get rid of all of the mumbo jumbo about Jesus being God, about Jesus rising from the dead, about Jesus doing miracles and all this. What really is the pure essence of the Christian faith is Jesus' ethic of love. Again, this fully ethical understanding of what Christianity is. Yes, what Jesus taught us was the universal fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of humanity, and the ethic of love for one another. And that's really what Jesus was here to teach us. That's really what Christianity is all about. That's the essence of Christianity. Nothing to do with sin and redemption. Nothing to do with God come to earth. Nothing to do with Christ dying in atonement for sin and rising from the dead. Nothing to do with Jesus coming as the judge of all the earth. Now, it's just all about the better way of living that Jesus taught us to follow. That's what Harnack said is the essence of Christianity. And so he said, basically, what we have to do when we study the Bible is we have to find the kernel and take that out and throw away the husk. The kernel is that ethical truth that Jesus taught, and the husk is all this other nonsense, things that don't stand up to rational scrutiny for the modern mind. He says this, "It is religion, the love of God and neighbor, which gives life a meaning. Knowledge cannot do it." Do you hear Kant's influence there? Religion has nothing to do with knowledge. And religion is all about ethics, the love of God and neighbor. That gives life meaning. Knowledge doesn't. And so we separate those two. Christianity is not about knowledge. It's about loving God and neighbor, which isn't about knowing. That's really what gives life meaning, according to Harnack. Now, you might be thinking, gee, that sounds like some people today, even some people within sort of the realm of evangelicalism. And I would say that's a good observation. That's an important observation. Hold on to that, because that's something that we need to explore more, and we will explore more as we go on through the semester. Okay, now all these things were going on in Europe. Let's jump across the ocean to the United States. And I want to look at a few trends in late 19th century America, again, that set the stage for what's going on in the 20th century and the development of religious history in the 20th century. One of the things that happens here is that we have the kind of liberalism, the liberal theology of Germans and other Europeans, but primarily the Germans, beginning to affect people who are religious leaders in America. One of them is a guy named William Ellery Channing, who was a New England Unitarian pastor. And a Unitarian is one who denies the Trinity. The Trinity is not rational, they would say, and we're seeking a rational religion. So we believe in God, but we don't believe he's Trinity. And in fact, during the 19th century, the idea in America in particular is really attractive to a lot of people, that humanity can be perfected. Yeah, we've got our problems, but we can be perfected with just the right influences. And really it comes through following rational approach to life and to think rationally about these things. And this is what Channing actually says here. He says, God is another name for human intelligence, raised above all error and imperfection and extended to all possible truth. Do you hear in there the echo of Ludwig Feuerbach, who says, oh, God is just humanity projected? Isn't that what Channing is saying? So you see that some of that same kind of thinking is beginning to take root in American religious life. Now, where Channing opened the door, Ralph Waldo Emerson walks right through. Ralph Waldo Emerson's not a Christian, though he would claim to be influenced and following Christ, but he's really what we call a transcendentalist, someone who really believes in the human divinity, essentially, that there's unlimited divine potential within each human being that needs to be unlocked. And he makes an address known the famous Divinity School address, where he speaks to Harvard Divinity School, and he makes the statement as part of his address there. He says, if man is at heart just, then insofar he is God. See, it's within us to become like God. The divine potential is within each one of us, and all we need is the right influences, the right thinking to set it free. Horace Bushnell is a lot more clearly identified as a Christian. He's a Christian pastor, but he's bringing in a lot of these liberal theological ideas into American theology, and so he's known as the father of American liberal theology. And his focus on religion, just along with the same kinds of things we saw happening in Germany, is to turn it to be more inward, more experiential, and a bit more in the ethical direction. And so he's just like some of the theologians that we saw in Germany, using Christian terms but redefining them according to some of the cultural ideas that are present in his day. So he says this: Christ is known only by them that receive him into their love, their faith, their deep want, known only as he is enshrined within, felt as a divine force, breathed in the inspirations of the secret life. It's all subjective, it's all feeling. That's what Bushnell is saying. Now, there are a whole lot of streams of thought that are involved in here, and we haven't talked about all of the different people that we could have talked about. This is not a history of Christian thought in the 19th century course, but I do want to show you just how a number of things kind of flow together, and these guys cross-fertilize. And when you come into the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, what you begin to see then is sort of the synthesis of a lot of these influences coming out in some key people that we're going to be studying as we move into our study of the 20th century. Now, there are a few other things that are going on in the culture in general in America, and I want to talk a little bit about those. One is the idea of progress. This picture here, this painting, is by a guy named John Gast, and it's called American Progress, and it really kind of shows their attitude toward kind of where America was. You see behind this woman who represents the spirit of progress running across the Western Plain. Behind her is the Mississippi River, and you see along with her comes the railroad, the stagecoach, the settlers, the prospectors. She is coming along stringing telegraph wire. Okay, so she's bringing this new technology of communication along with her, and in her right hand she holds a book. No, that's not the Bible. That's a school book. So she's bringing knowledge, and notice that she brings light with her as well, and the darkness is retreating before her, along with the Native Americans, if you notice down there kind of in the lower left corner. This is how America saw herself in the late 1800s. We're conquering this nation. We're bringing productivity and progress with our technology, and it's just an inevitable movement forward. We're just headed that way. And progress now becomes sort of what dictates the future of America, and no longer the idea of God's providence, God's gracious care for his people. An interesting and important change, and that's something that comes from one of the key cultural ideas of the 19th century. That is the idea of progress. Another thing that shapes American religion is its Protestant character. We are basically a Protestant nation all through the beginning part of our founding into the 19th century, but there's very much a frontier kind of a flavor that enters into American Protestant identity that comes from things like the camp meetings and the revivalistic approaches that became popular in the 19th century. This is a picture of what's called the Cane Ridge Revival. It's a big camp meeting. Folks who lived in kind of the rural areas on the western frontier, back in that time it was like in Kentucky and Ohio. But since they were in small communities, widely separated, occasionally they would just have a big get-together, and all these people would come and they would camp together, and they would have different preachers in who would preach and kind of use all kinds of enthusiastic and emotional types of appeals, and it would get a lot of people all stirred up. Of course, there's a lot of other things going on kind of in around the fringes. They were pretty crazy kinds of situations, but that was something that was happening in various places around the American frontier, and that gave a certain flavor to American religion. So, some specific things that shaped Protestant identity in America include the First Great Awakening, which I'll call the pietistic influence on American Christianity, and that is the turn to the idea that true religion is something that affects a change within the heart. Of course, that's something near and dear to us as evangelicals, the idea of conversion, that we go from a state of estrangement to God or from God to a state of reconciliation with Him. And that involves a change within the heart. Heart religion is what you might say, pietistic thinking has brought to American religious identity. Now, in the Second Great Awakening, the First Great Awakening was in the 1730s and 40s, influenced by people like George Whitefield, Jonathan Edwards, and to a certain extent, John Wesley, though his influence was more directly in England. But in the Second Great Awakening, which occurs in the early 1800s, basically from the 18 teens roughly to the 1830s, you have a number of things, kind of like the Cane Ridge Revival, kind of like other meetings of those types, where you have a certain style of preaching, a certain style of trying to affect people religiously through preaching and through these meetings that becomes known as the Second Great Awakening. But that's where the revivalistic influence on American Protestantism comes in. The idea that that preachers have to preach in such a way as to bring about change, and not only that, but that in so doing they use specific techniques, that it becomes a matter of the preacher's technique, even more so, and maybe even to the exclusion of any specific influence from the Holy Spirit. This is what one of the primary thinkers of the Second Great Awakening, a guy named Charles Finney, argued in his lectures on revivals of religion. American Protestant identity in the 19th century was very conservative in terms of their theology. Most of the people in the country did not go with kind of that trend on the East Coast of the Unitarian, more liberal thinking of people like William Ellery Channing and Horace Bushnell. For the most part, American Protestantism was fairly conservative, both theologically and ethically as well. Traditional morality was something that was also strongly a part of American religion. It was also quite populist. And one of the things you see in America in the 19th century in particular is an explosion of different popular religious movements, new religious movements, new sects like Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, Christian Science. A number of these things begin to pop up all over the place. Basically, if you could attract a following through your charismatic appeal, through your ability to convince people and get them excited, then you could start your own denomination, and many people did. And so we have a whole lot of kind of popular religious movements that kind of focus around charismatic individuals that become sort of the centers of new religious denominations and things, both Orthodox and not so Orthodox, as in the case of like Mormonism. And it tended to be anti-intellectual. And partly that was because of the direction that intellectual thinking in Europe in particular had taken religious studies. But I think that in some ways it was almost proud to be very simple, and that kind of goes along with that populism that we were talking about. But in 1873, at an evangelical meeting of evangelical leaders in America, William Warren, one of the prominent spokespeople in this group, got up and made the statement, well, we don't have to worry about a lot of those things that are happening in Europe because we have no Strauss. There is no David Strauss here to stir things up. So his argument was that somehow America had been isolated from those trends, and he was sort of proud of that. That's kind of that anti-intellectualism coming through. Well, unfortunately, within another 20 years, Strauss and greater than Strauss's in terms of their departures from the faith would spring up in America, and William Warren proved to have very little insight here as to what he should have worried about and what he shouldn't have worried about. Okay, another thing that really began to affect American religion was the influence of the Gilded Age. And this is the era of the great robber barons, railroad moguls, such as Cornelius Vanderbilt. And this is, by the way, Biltmore, his mansion. It looks like a castle. It's an American mansion that he built for himself out of his great railway empire. John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, and many of these other titans of American industry. Andrew Carnegie became fabulously wealthy, and the kind of disparity between the wealthy class and the rest of America was very clearly seen, and the wealthy folks were very extravagant and conspicuous about that. And this is in basically the post-Civil War period, particularly 1880s, 1890s era. And this was just a real time where there was a lot of growth in industry, and some people were making out very well. Other people were kind of chewed up by the machine. So it was a time of prosperity for the upper classes, which was very materialistic and ostentatious. This is a cartoon, an editorial cartoon from the time, kind of showing how people thought about some of these folks. Another thing that influenced America during this period was the growth of American civil religion. And that came in a lot of ways out of the Civil War era. There was an assumption that America was a Christian nation, and even before the Civil War, or during the Civil War, both sides thought that God was on their side. Though Lincoln, as you might know, was a little more reticent about that, and he was hoping that God was on the side of the Union, but recognized that God had his plans, and that there were people on the other side who were also, claiming God for their cause as well. But there was a very strong assumption that, Protestantism, Protestant Christianity was just a part of what America was, because most Americans were Protestant. And so it was just therefore kind of assumed America was a Christian nation. And you can see that even in some of the things like the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which is a Civil War era song. And if you notice, it's using language and imagery from the book of Revelation to speak about what's happening in the war. The grapes of wrath, that's a picture from Revelation, the picture of judgment. God is the one who is coming in these visions. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. And notice in the second verse here, I have seen him, that is Christ the Lord, in the watchfires of 100 circling camps. So Christ is there with the Union Army. He is, in this war, verse 3, he sounded forth the trumpet that shall never call retreat. He's sifting out the hearts of men before his judgment seat. This is his judgment. He's judging this nation. He's judging us through this war. And then the fourth verse, which is just incredible. In the beauty of the lilies, Christ was born across the sea with a glory in his bosom that transfigures you and me. As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free, while God is marching on. God is on our side, of course. That's American civil religion. What Americans are doing, particularly what the Union is doing in this case, is doing God's work. And so that assumption just was a very natural part of the way people were thinking during this era. Now, as the 19th century wore on, there were a lot more people who kind of took this American civil religion and turned it into pragmatic ends, to try to develop some kind of a vague spiritualistic kind of common language and common imagery that they could use to sort of unite people, particularly politically. And so American civil religion now becomes very much tied with American politics. And Christianity became co-opted to serve the interests of society. This also happened in business. There, in the late 19th century, develops what people called the gospel of wealth. The idea that by following God's principles, you will become rich, sort of the precursors of the prosperity gospel. And that was very much wrapped up in American civil religious thinking in the 19th century. Now, I just want to mention a couple of things that were going on, some controversies that showed that even though America kind of had this overlay of civil religion, even though they all saw themselves as Protestant, even though they were generally conservative, there began to, by the end of the 19th century, be some cracks in this, because more of this thinking is beginning to infiltrate from Germany and from the eastern regions of the United States, and beginning to affect people in other places. And one place we see this is in Presbyterian Church. A pastor by the name of David Swing, who was very popular, had a large following in the city of Chicago, begins to preach some messages that really kind of draw on liberal thinking, theological liberal thinking, and begin to call into question some of the traditional beliefs of the Christian faith. And so David Swing, had certain ideas about Scripture, that maybe it wasn't really fully God's word, maybe it was people's words about God, and that it could kind of point us in the right direction, but we don't have to look at it as authoritative and read it as the church has traditionally done. And he also emphasized that Christianity was a way of life, a way of living. So there's that ethical aspect that's influencing his thinking. He was brought up on charges of heresy and tried in the Presbyterian denomination in Chicago. Another controversy comes on the East Coast. Union Theological Seminary, a guy named Charles Briggs, who's a professor there, professor of Hebrew and Old Testament. And again, he begins to articulate some of these ideas that are part of sort of the European higher critical studies beginning to affect folks here in the United States. And so he's questioning a lot of the historicity of the Old Testament. And he's treating the Old Testament as stories about God that should be subjected to historical study. And these kinds of things cause him to, again, be singled out and investigated and charged with heresy. And that becomes an issue at the seminary he teaches at. But the seminary ended up standing behind him, and so then the seminary begins to take its stance on supporting these higher critical methods of Scripture study. And so that's another important controversy that shows some of the cracks in American religious identity at this point. Another thing that sets the stage for the 20th century and some of the challenges and difficulties in religion in the 20th century in America are just cultural changes that are taking place. There's a lot more urbanization and industrialization. As the factories are built, then people have to move close to the factories. Those are in the cities, the areas of commerce. People begin to get crowded in. We have children sometimes working for 12, 14 hours a day, every day, tending the machines in the mills. We have, people crowded into tenements because they didn't make a lot of money, and so they, had to kind of concentrate their housing. And so this picture down here at the bottom in 1900 kind of shows you a typical residential area where you've got all these people crowded into these buildings. These are things that are happening. So the economy is shifting. You're going from more and more people who had been employed in farms to now more and more people working in industry and moving to the cities. So you've got more concentration of people in the cities. You've got then more difficulties with people getting along. You've got different ethnicities in different regions. Sometimes there are rivalries between them. You've got breakdown of families because you've got people who are separated from the family, fathers who are gone essentially much of the day. You got more opportunities for drinking, gambling, carousing, and these kinds of things. Another influence on America at this time is an increasing number of immigrants, many coming from Europe and various places. Italy, Ireland, Eastern Europe, various folks are just coming in, and we've got a lot of folks coming into the United States at this point, and then beginning to assimilate these people who speak different language, who have different culture, who eat different food, and all these kinds of things. That becomes a difficult and challenging issue for society. And again, all of these cultural influences are also influencing attitudes of people in the church and attitudes of the church in its ministry in various ways. A third important trend is what we'll call secularization, and that is the tendency for American culture to really turn away from its religious moorings and see life for most people and most of life as something separate from influenced by religion. And you see that in one area, particularly in the universities and the colleges in America. Many of the colleges in America were started as institutions to train pastors, and many of them, the presidents were religious people, pastors or other folks who'd been educated with a religious education. But as the German European university model becomes sort of the standard for the university, American institutions want to model themselves after that, and you see a big change in the mission and the leadership of American institutions. And as Marsden points out in this quote here, he says, "Within hardly a generation, vast areas of American thought and academic life had been removed from all reference to Protestant or biblical considerations." Pastors were no longer presidents of universities. It was other folks, scholars and businessmen and people like that. And just, Christianity was no longer considered central to the task of educating people. Secularization also affects politics. There's still a lot of politicians talking in civil religious rhetoric, but they're sold out to business interests. And American government really becomes focused in many ways during this era on business interests. Here's a contemporary editorial cartoon. This is John D. Rockefeller, and you see he's got the White House in the palm of his hand, and the Capitol in the distance there is one of his refineries for his oil empire. And so, that kind of shows you how people thought about things at that time. And I'd kind of mentioned this already before, but business becomes, really the focus for many people of kind of the gospel of wealth. The religious interests of these people were really turned toward trying to figure out how they could become more wealthy. And so the gospel of wealth became the dominant theme. And as Marsden observes in this quote here, the religious and moral concerns of the people of the time seemed directed toward justifying what the competitive demands for business success would have dictated anyway. So a lot more people are kind of seeing Christianity through the lens of what the business people wanted and what they felt would be best. So again, you've got that cultural influence on American Christianity there. And it's really a secularization, because it's not what does God want businessmen to do, but really how can businessmen appropriate certain things from Christianity that they can use to further their own interests. And so this brings us back to where we started our discussion, Christianity and culture. How has culture affected American Christianity? How has American Christianity responded to the cultural influences and adopted them into their own thinking? This is really what our study is all about. And you can see that just by this quick survey of some of the things that are happening in the 19th century, things are headed toward a really interesting collision here as we look at how American Christianity in the early 20th century responds to these different things. So we'll be focusing on that next week when I'm back from Egypt and we're together again in class.